You wake up. There's no alarm. The light is changing in a way that your body recognizes, and you're just awake. You sit up. Around you, people are already moving or still sleeping. There's no schedule telling you what comes next. No email waiting. No meetings. No performance metrics. You could hunt. You could make something. You could sit and talk to someone. You could sleep more. The day is completely open, and nobody is going to judge you for whatever you choose. For most of human history, this was normal. Every single day operated like this. No structure imposed from above. No timeline someone else created. Just you and a genuinely open day. And here's the thing that nobody tells you. People didn't fill those days with panic or despair. They filled them with things that we've somehow convinced ourselves are luxuries. Things that modern people have to squeeze into evenings or weekends, if we squeeze them in at all. We've inherited this narrative that work is natural, that humans are naturally industrious, that if you don't structure your time around productivity, you'll waste it or decay. But that narrative is really recent. It's maybe 200 years old if we're being generous. For the other 200,000 years of human existence, people organized their time differently. And when anthropologists and archaeologists actually look at how that time was distributed, what they find is genuinely surprising. Early populations weren't working harder than us. They were working less. They weren't more stressed about resources. They were, in many measurable ways, less stressed. They had something we've largely lost: genuine discretionary time. And the question of what they did with it tells us a lot about what we become. The first thing you need to understand is that subsistence, actually getting food and basic resources, didn't consume the majority of the day. We have good data on this from studying contemporary hunter-gatherer populations, and we have indirect evidence from the archaeological record. The anthropologist Marshall Solins coined a term for this in the 1970s. The original affluent society. The idea is counterintuitive. Populations without agriculture, without grocery stores, without supply chains, had more leisure time than modern industrial societies. Why? Because they needed less stuff. And getting basic resources, food, shelter, water, wasn't actually that time-intensive if your expectations were calibrated to what was actually available. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups, like the San people of the Kalahari, show something striking. They spend roughly 15 to 20 hours per week on food acquisition. That's it. The rest of the time is theirs. No commute. No meetings that could have been emails. No performance review. Just time. Early populations across different regions, from the Arctic to the tropics, seem to have operated on similar principles. You hunt or gather until you've got enough. Then you stop. You don't accumulate surplus just to accumulate it. You don't work extra hours to buy things you don't need. You work enough, and then you have the rest of your time for other things. What were those other things? This is where the conventional narrative completely falls apart, because we assume that without work structure, people would do nothing. They'd sit around and stare at nothing. They'd get bored. They'd atrophy mentally. Yet the evidence suggests the opposite. They made things. They made a lot of things. The artistic record from early human populations is genuinely staggering. Bone carvings, cave paintings, decorated tools, sculptured figurines, musical instruments. These aren't byproducts of free time. They're evidence that early populations were creating art consistently, sometimes obsessively. Some scholars argue that the drive to create was actually more fundamental to human nature than the drive to accumulate resources. Think about what creating art actually requires. It requires sustained attention. It requires developing skill over time. It requires practicing the same motion thousands of times until your hand and brain are coordinated in a specific way. A person doesn't develop the ability to paint sophisticated animal figures on a cave wall without spending enormous amounts of time practicing. Somewhere, early humans were sitting down intentionally and practicing art for its own sake, not because someone forced them to, not because it generated income, simply because the activity itself was rewarding, and because their culture valued it enough to invest time in passing those skills forward to the next generation. The same is probably true for music. We have evidence of bone flutes going back 40,000 years. Someone made those. Someone played them. And they were good enough that they got preserved, which means they were probably made well and valued. You don't make a precision instrument by accident. You make it because you've decided to spend time mastering the craft. Early populations probably had musicians and artists and craftspeople who weren't doing those things as hobbies. They were doing them as their actual focus, their actual skill, the thing they were known for. We just didn't have a system where that could be a job in the modern sense. It was just what they did. Storytelling might be the biggest one, though, and it's almost completely invisible in the archaeological record. You can't dig up a story. You can find evidence that people gathered, burn marks from fires, bones from shared meals, or patterns on the ground from repeated gatherings. Yet the actual stories are gone. Yet we know from contemporary oral cultures that storytelling was and is central to human society. Stories transmit knowledge. They transmit values. They explain how the world works. They provide entertainment. They help people process fear and difficulty. Early populations probably had people who were exceptionally good at storytelling, who were known for their stories, who commanded attention when they spoke. The activity wasn't economically productive in the modern sense. It was culturally essential. What's fascinating is how much of this, art, music, storytelling, craft mastery, we've relegated to leisure in modern life. We talk about work and then about what we do in our free time, as though they're fundamentally different categories. Yet for most of human history, they weren't. The things that occupied your time were just the things that occupied your time. Some were about immediate survival. Some were about creating beauty or meaning. Some were about developing skill. Some were probably just about hanging out with people you liked. The categories we've created, work versus leisure, productive versus unproductive, they're modern inventions, and they've completely distorted how we think about what constitutes a good use of time. Beyond creating, early populations spent significant time on what we might call social maintenance. Gossip, talking, relationship building, conflict resolution, ritual, ceremony. These weren't frivolous activities. They were the infrastructure that kept communities functioning. Humans are intensely social creatures. We require connection the way we require food. And maintaining those connections requires time and attention. Yet modern life has systematized most of that away. We see friends when we have time. We schedule hangouts weeks in advance. We communicate through screens. Early populations were together constantly. They knew everything about each other. They worked out conflicts face to face. They celebrated together. They grieved together. The amount of time devoted to maintaining relationships and group cohesion was enormous, and it was probably one of the primary sources of meaning and satisfaction in daily life. There's also evidence that early populations slept differently than we do. We assume everyone sleeps in one long block at night, but that's actually a relatively recent pattern. Historical records and contemporary studies of pre-industrial societies suggest that many populations practiced what's called biphasic sleep, sleeping in two chunks with a period of wakefulness in between. You'd sleep, wake up for an hour or two, do quiet activities like working on a craft or talking or thinking, and then sleep again. This wasn't insomnia. It was a normal rhythm. And it meant that nighttime wasn't just downtime. It was productive time, contemplative time, time to work on things that didn't require the full energy of daylight hunting or gathering. Rest itself was probably approached differently. We live in a culture that valorizes constant productivity, where rest is something you have to earn and feel guilty about. Early populations probably understood rest as a basic human need without the guilt attached. You rested when you were tired. You worked when you had energy. There was no external force saying you should be more industrious or optimize your output. That sounds luxurious to modern ears, and it probably was in some ways. Yet there's a counterpoint that we shouldn't ignore. The romantic version of early human life, leisured, artistic, communal, unstressed, is incomplete. Early life was also unpredictable. A hunting trip might fail. A food source might disappear. Disease could wipe out significant portions of a group. Infant mortality was horrendous by modern standards. Women faced the genuine risk of death in childbirth. Accidents and injuries, without modern medicine, could be catastrophic. Social conflict within groups could be violent. Relationships with neighboring groups could turn hostile. Early populations weren't living in paradise. They had genuine hardship and genuine uncertainty. The leisure time that existed was real, yet it existed alongside real danger and real loss. The quality of life, even with abundant free time, wasn't unambiguously better than modern life. It was just fundamentally different in its structure and its stressors. Additionally, we have to be careful about assuming that all early populations operated the same way. The San people of the Kalahari might have had 15 to 20 hours of work per week, yet hunter-gatherers in more resource-scarce environments might have worked harder. Populations that relied on seasonal fishing or hunting might have had periods of intense labor followed by periods of rest. Populations facing harsher climates probably spent more time on shelter and resource management. There wasn't one universal pattern. There were probably dozens or hundreds of different ways of organizing time and labor depending on geography, climate, available resources, and cultural values. Yet the overall pattern that emerges is clear: structured work as we understand it, showing up somewhere at a scheduled time to do something someone else has decided you should do, in order to receive a wage or maintain employment. That's a recent invention. For the vast majority of human history, labor was task-based, not time-based. You worked until the task was done. You didn't work a fixed number of hours. You didn't work for someone else's profit. You worked to meet needs and to create things that matter to you. And that's a fundamentally different relationship to labor. What strikes me about this is what it reveals about modern work culture. We tell ourselves that we work because we have to, because survival requires it. Yet early populations had survival pressures that were arguably greater than ours: uncertain food supply, no medical system, environmental unpredictability, and they managed to organize their lives around principles other than maximizing productive output. We've created a system where people work more than they need to, in order to buy things they don't need, in order to fill time that we've structured so that there's no time left for the things that probably matter more: creation, relationships, rest, mastery for its own sake. The deeper insight here is about what humans actually need to be satisfied. We need to feel competent. We need to create. We need connection. We need time for contemplation and rest. We need to develop mastery in things that matter to us. We need meaning. Early populations had structures that provided all of these things. Modern work provides income, and we use income to try to buy these things. But the system is designed in a way that actually prevents us from getting them. You're too tired from work to create. You don't have time for relationships. You can't develop mastery in anything because you're focused on the job. The irony is that we become more productive and accumulated more stuff, yet we're probably less satisfied with how we spend our time than populations that worked a fraction as much. So what were ancient humans doing all day? The honest answer is, whatever they wanted, within the constraints of their environment and their group's needs. Some of them were creating art and music and stories. Some were developing crafts and getting genuinely good at things they cared about. Some were maintaining relationships and navigating social complexity. Some were sleeping or resting. Some were in those gaps between structured activity, just sitting and thinking or talking or watching the world. They weren't doing these things because they were forced to. They weren't doing them because of external deadlines or metrics. They were doing them because those are the things that seem to matter to humans when we're not forced into other patterns. And maybe that's the real question we should be asking. Not how did they fill their days without jobs. Yet, what would we do with our time if we had the luxury of genuine discretion? If we weren't constrained by work schedules and financial obligations, what would actually matter to us? What would we create? Who would we spend time with? What would we get genuinely good at? What would we think about if we weren't thinking about work? The answer to those questions might tell us something important about what we actually want our lives to be, as opposed to what the system has convinced us our lives should be. Check the community tab, and thanks for watching.